Well, the first advice is learn Romani. Once you know Romani, it breaks the ice, basically. But this particular variety has borrowed an accusative suffix from Hungarian, so it says something like tikavmradat. D is the Hungarian accusative suffix. We have to fight our own racism. I mean, that's another thing. And I still have to fight it sometimes. I realize it during field work. That's actually a very interesting.
Welcome to Conversations with Romani Linguists. My name is Anastasiia. I'm an educational influencer and promoter of the Romani language.
And my name is Yaron. I'm a linguist and I specialize in the study of the Romani language.
In this series of interviews, we talk to linguists working on the Romani language. We are eager to know how they became interested in specialized research on the Romani language, what challenges they faced on their professional path, and what fascinating stories and discoveries they had working on Romani. Today, we are pleased to introduce our guest, Viktor Elšík. Viktor is lecturer at the Department of Linguistics at Charles University in Prague, the Czech Republic. Viktor, we are glad to have you with us and welcome to our podcast.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you for agreeing to join us and to share your experience. And let's start our conversation by speaking about your past, about your background, and let's look back to your childhood. Could you tell us, please, about your family, where you grew up, and your school years?
Okay. I come from the Czech Republic and I live here. I was born in Prague, but we lived in a small townlet just next to Prague. Yaron knows the place. He's been there once or twice. And my father is a Moravian, which is sort of half Czech, half Slovak, I would say. Valachian, to be precise. My mother is from Bohemia, which is the western part of the country. And I was growing up both in the Czech Republic and at that time it was Czechoslovakia. And in Russia for some time because my father got a job in Moscow when I was 2 years old. So we moved to Russia for 5 years and we lived there. So I sort of grew up with two languages, but I forgot Russian. I can't speak it. Well, I can to some extent, but I wouldn't. When I meet someone who speaks Russian, I prefer speaking English with them nowadays. So that's the linguistic background. Otherwise, I only spoke Czech. We had Russian at school. And we had some schoolmates who were Romani. That's probably would be another question.
Your first encounter with Romani.
Sorry?
It was your first encounter with Romani, wasn't it?
Yes. It was on the how do you call it? The primary school. I think in the second class there was a girl who came to our class. Her family moved from Slovakia. They moved directly from a Romani settlement. And actually, the memories are not good because, at the time, well, it was the fault of the teacher. The teacher let her sit alone. And if somebody did something wrong, they would, be punished by sitting next to her. So I was growing up in such an environment that was quite terrible. I didn't realize it as a kid, but, later on, it came to my mind, such terrible things were happening. But nevertheless, there were some Romani schoolmates in our class, in other classes, although most Romani children actually attended so-called special classes, but some of them managed to get their children to the normal schools. But these children didn't speak Romani, and if they did only spoke phrases. So I remember my first phrase in Romani was "Giacere more," go home, guy. And I didn't know what it means, and the guy didn't know what it means, but he heard it from his parents probably, or grandparents, something like that. Yeah, and the girl who moved from Slovakia, she probably spoke Romani, but I never heard her speaking Romani. So it was like first touch with the language. And yeah.
Okay, and if you had such not good memories, tell us please about your university. Why did you decide to continue studying and get a higher education? So,
I come from a middle-class family and it was somehow supposed that I will continue my studies. So I went to a secondary school and I was interested in linguistics actually quite early on, already at the primary school. So I applied for general linguistics and Czech studies, Bohemian studies. And while studying general linguistics, which turned out to be the more interesting program for me than the Czech studies, I wanted to have a special language, to learn some language properly, to maybe do some research on that language. But I started not with Romani, but with Albanian. I studied Albanian for 3 years in a BA program. I never finished it. The problem there was that we didn't have the chance to go to Albania. We didn't have the chance to speak the language. And then I realized, well, we have a great minority here in the Czech Republic and also in other parts of Central Europe, in Slovakia, which speaks a language which is under-researched or was under-researched at the time. And I thought this would be it. It's something new. I will learn the language. I will learn about it. I have a chance to do some research, and there were also very nice people at the faculty. Milena Hipšmanová was my major teacher in Romani studies. So I applied for a program in Romani studies while I already had my linguistic studies behind me, and I never finished that, but I already started to work on Romani. And an important figure in my career is sitting here with us, or is viewing us, is Jaron, who invited me to Manchester a long time ago. I can't even count how long ago it was. I think it was
Perhaps Jaron remembers.
27 years ago, maybe.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. And that started, I wouldn't say my interest in Romani, but it started some serious interest in the language. I learned lots about methodology and about the general linguistic context, etc., etc. So I was really happy that I had this experience in the past.
Do you remember what challenge did you encounter when working on Romani? Some obstacles, perhaps?
Obstacles. Well, the major obstacle nowadays is financing, but I don't think we want to talk about this financing of the research, of the travels, etc. So I usually finance it myself at the moment. So
Why not? It's important topic, actually.
So frequently we go, me and my girlfriend and our children, we go to holidays to Slovakia, and sometimes just for a few days. I get off and I leave them behind and do some research while we are there, and do some recording with Romani speakers, etc. But I'm not in the field as I used to be, which it was a nice time when we had projects and we had money to travel. So I could say that I lost touch a little bit with the Romani people in Slovakia, which was the place where I went most frequently. Although I'm trying to go and visit my friends in a village called Selice, where I go most frequently. I try to go there at least once a year, but sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. That's the major obstacle. And otherwise, no real obstacles if you mean during field work. It was a very pleasant experience. Sometimes it was difficult to find the speakers, because we usually, I was listening to your conversation with Zhu Bodnárova. She described it quite well. We took a bus somewhere, we got off the bus and we were asking about Roma, whether the Roma live here. And, sometimes we found them, sometimes we didn't. Sometimes we found someone who was willing to cooperate. Sometimes the people were too old or too busy or uninterested. So that was sort of the most difficult part of the field work, making the contact, but it was also the most exciting part of field work, I would say.
Can I just interject on the issue of the obstacles? Going back to that early experience that you described with the Romani girl in your primary school classroom. I remember something that you once said to me when you started studying Romani studies with Milena Hipšmanová, how the group of students who chose that subject was all, this wasn't perhaps your word, but isolated in a way, or maybe self-isolated, because you described it to me once, enthusiastic about exploring the inequality, challenging the inequality, And that made you quite an exclusive club. So it wasn't something that was very popular. Do you remember that, or talking about it? Maybe come back to that and explain in more detail and more accuracy than I've been able to paraphrase it now for you.
I think you got it quite accurately. Yeah, that's what I remember from those times, and it's still the case to some extent, although to a lesser extent. Uh, People who are not xenophobic against Roma are not very commonly encountered in Prague. Nowadays, it's the situation is better, but at those times, we had to fight our families. I mean, with argument. Uh, we had to fight our friends. We had to, so that made us quite a close group of people who share these views, and we had to fight our own racism. I mean, that's another thing, and I still have to fight it sometimes. I realize it during field work. That's actually a very interesting aspect of it. Whenever I go somewhere, there's always these small stereotypes which I know are not correct, etc., but they are somewhere hidden in the subconsciousness. And then you meet the people, you talk to them, and you feel like a fool. How come that I still keep to this after 20 years of being friends with lots of Romani people, etc. It's deeply rooted in the way we were educated. I remember these small remarks, you hear from time to time from members of your family, etc., etc. It can't have no effect on you. It can't have can't. It's impossible to not to have an effect on someone who's growing up in such an environment. So, yeah.
And now I like to ask you, you mentioned about it when the question was about obstacles, yeah, that one of the challenge was to find native speakers, yeah. So, and could you give some pieces of advice which helped you to overcome this obstacle?
Well, the first advice is learn Romani. Once you know Romani, it breaks the ice basically. So if you start speaking Romani, then the people already, have some faith in you and some trust in you, and they are more interested in what you want from them, and you can start communicating. It creates a bond. Quite frequently, I'm not a Rom myself, I'm Gajo, but quite frequently people thought I must be Rom because I speak Romani. So that's very important. Of course, the knowledge of the Romani language didn't help in areas where Roma don't speak Romani, but then the way I did research was that we sort of made note of the fact that Romani is no longer spoken there and moved on, because we were interested rather than in the social linguistic situation, we were interested in the dialectological data. So that wasn't such a problem. So this is another thing is, of course, come as an equal, don't pretend, come directly to the people, don't go to the mayor or, the teacher or someone first. Go directly to the people, ask what you want from them. Don't come with an external authority. That could be the advice, maybe.
Thank you, thank you. And now let's speak more about your scientific work in the Romani language field. And now it's floor for Jeroen.
Thanks. Yeah, let's come back to that village, Selice, in Slovakia that you mentioned, that you said you go to frequently, almost every year, and quite a lot of your work on Romani has been there. Let's kind of start with that. And let's also start with one of your publications that arose from your work in Selice, which is about the lexicon. People who are not linguists and don't really study many languages often think of language as words, the words that you find in a dictionary, and you think that the dictionary describes the whole language. And of course, for professional linguists, actually, the rules of grammar are and how they evolve perhaps are the more interesting. But of course, we can't speak without words. And one of the things you wrote and published about Selice Romani was about the profile of the lexicon, so the basically the words, the inventory of words, and that was in a volume that looked at what we call in linguistics lexical borrowing. So how words are taken from one language and used in another language, which pretty much most languages that we know of, that we know a little bit about their history, have that. English, of course, a lot from French and Latin and almost every language. Now, your chapter, there's, I think, something like 40 chapters in that book. People looked at different languages using a solid method. So everybody had the same list. And they went around and they looked, with that list of, was it around 1,400 or 1,500 entries of meanings, how many of those meanings have been borrowed at some point or other into the language. And your article, I think, in terms of the quantity, the percentage had the top score, as it were. So Selitsa-Romani was, very, very high. I think it was, if I remember correctly, 60 or 70% of those core words were borrowed. So tell us a little bit about that. First of all, how does one investigate what is borrowed and what isn't? Because, I mean, presumably many speakers are not aware of at least the older layers of borrowing. How do you investigate that? And how does a language continue to exist if so much of its lexicon comes from other languages? And also, are there particular, I mean, actually, maybe the question to ask there is not just what is borrowed, but what is not borrowed? Why are there certain words that are not borrowed? What kind of words are not borrowed?
Mhm. Okay, thank you for this question. Yeah, and the Selitsa-Romani sample, which you mentioned, had, I think, 69% of loan words, but they were also counting older loan words, actually words which have been in the language for maybe millennia in some cases even. But quite importantly, in this particular variety, most of the loan words, by far, were Hungarianisms, loan words from Hungarian, which is the major contact language of the Selitsa-Romani speakers. They live in southwestern Slovakia in a small village which was traditionally Hungarian Romani. Nowadays, Slovak is also at play. At least from 1918 when Czechoslovakia was founded. But still, Hungarian remains to be the sort of primary second language because it's also a language of a secondary ethnic identity. The people, they identify as Roms, as Roma, but at the same time, a quite important part of their identity is the attribute Hungarian Roms. We are Hungarian Roms. We have lived here for centuries, since times immemorial. They don't remember where they came and started to live in the village. There was a settlement. There used to be a settlement, which was there at least 200 years, I think. We don't know where they came exactly. And they identify with certain aspects of Hungarian culture. On the other hand, still remaining their own Romani culture, distinct from the local Hungarian culture. And I think this cultural setup is also important for explaining the amount of Hungarian loanwords, because there are loanwords from our secondary language, from the language of our secondary identity, from a locally prestigious language, although it's a minority language in Slovakia, Hungarian. And the loanwords are not sanctioned by the speakers. So you can, if you record or talk to people of different generations, you can see how gradually some older pre-Hungarian words are being replaced by Hungarian words. To give an example, nowadays everybody says apósi for father-in-law, which is from Hungarian após, and pinteko for Friday, which is from Hungarian péntek or pintek in local Hungarian. The oldest generation used to say parastú, but they died out already. Yeah? And there are different boundaries in terms of generation where you can see how the words are being gradually replaced, and there are no sanctions. There's no laughter. On the other hand, not every Hungarian word can be incorporated into Romani speech. If it's not a usual loan word, then people would sanction it, right? At some stage. So, for example, if you say, I don't know, I can't remember now an example, but you would use a Hungarian word where there is a perfectly normal, common Romani word, it could create some sanctions. But they must be weak. The sanctions must be weak because, you know,
when you say sanctions, do you mean rejection, that people would say we can't say that, we shouldn't say that? Is that what you mean?
we shouldn't say that, or, you know, repeating after you and laughing and stuff. So there are actually sanctions. I'm contradicting myself. The thing is that the old words are not mourned. People are not sad that they are gone, that they are leaving the language. On the other hand, it's not possible to incorporate any Hungarian word into Romani, of course. And I forgot the rest of your question. There was a complex question.
Well, which is there a profile? Can we sort of generalize? Is there a type of words that are more resistant to loan words? So words that survive longer, words that people would tend to, as you say, sanction, so not easily incorporate from Hungarian. If you look at that whole sample of 1,400 words that you worked with for the comparison with the other colleagues, is there a particular domain of reference, types of words and what they denote that are sort of protected from being loan words from the other language?
Mhm. Well, first of all, some grammatical words like pronouns are quite resistant to contact, to borrowing. Um, in terms of the content words like nouns and verbs, etc., I would guess that the frequency is an important aspect, and also some cognitive closeness, you know, something which is, you know, like part of the intimate surroundings of the person. On the other hand, in Salice, for example, they borrow some terms for body parts, they borrow some terms for kinship, as we saw, father-in-law. But there are some hierarchies, as you know, borrowing hierarchies. So some things are more easily borrowed. I'm quite skeptical about a model that would predict which words are unborrowable. Now I was looking at another dialect in contact with Hungarian, which is spoken also in Slovakia, but pretty far away. It's from a distinct dialect group, from the North Central group. And they borrow things which Salice Romani don't. And on the other hand, Salice Romani borrows which they don't. And I don't, why Salice Romani retains the word for neck and the word for rabbit, and the East Gemme Romani borrows it. And on the other hand, why East Gemme Romani retains the Romani word for grass, but Salice Romani borrows it? I don't know. I have no idea. So, yeah, the closeness, frequency, cultural importance of the words would be the issue. Yeah.
And that latter point, brings us to a sort of a reflection about how much science is there in linguistics, because sometimes you think that science, generally speaking, is about explaining and predicting everything, but there are things that language is part of behavior, and it's not always possible to mechanically predict everything. But that was, again, I guess that's why it's fascinating to compare. And there are not really many studies that compare Romani systematically with other languages. And that's why I wanted to start with talking about that article of yours, because it really is situated as we said, this comparative volume, 40 scholars each looking at their languages and using the same method. And that tells us something perhaps also about where we've gotten in the past generation or so of work on Romani, for Romani to be considered in the context of more general linguistic, universal comparative studies of languages, which brings me to another domain of linguistics that you've specialized in, which we call linguistic typology, which is basically about identifying what types of structure different languages have, whether the languages are related or not. Maybe they're spoken in completely different parts of the world. But there's the assumption is that there's only a certain number of types that can occur across languages in terms of combining structures. And I think you've described yourself as a typologist, and you've interacted a lot with linguistic typologists and who aspire to kind of compare structures across languages. and you've contributed from Romani. So I want to ask you specifically about a few categories, but first of all, from a linguistic typological point of view, so from a kind of a comparison, universal comparativist point of view on languages, what would you say a couple of things that are particular in Romani? Why is Romani interesting from a typological perspective? Where does it stand out in terms of its structural behavior among languages of the world?
Wow, it's a difficult question. I actually don't think about myself as a typologist. I think about myself as a typologically inspired descriptive linguist.
Okay, I'm sorry. I used the shortcut then. Okay.
But yeah, but I'm trying to read typological literature. Um, what I found interesting is, I'll have to write about it once, but to compare, for example, these two languages, Salice Roma use, Romani and Hungarian in typological terms. I actually did some work on that, so far unpublished. I tried to fill in GramBank database, that's a typological database with features for Salice Romani and Hungarian, and compare where they align and where they don't, because there's lots of influence from Hungarian to Salice Romani, also in these structural, broadly typological parameters. What would be interesting about Romani? What comes to mind in general would be this distinction between oikoclitic and xenoclitic morphology, which is, it's a term, right? But how to explain it briefly? Quite frequently, if languages borrow some words from a contact language, they might borrow it together with its morphology, and the morphology can remain on words of that origin. Like, for example, some Latin loanwords in English might retain their Latin plurals, for example.
Fungus and fungi, for example, which most English speakers get wrong anyway, but
Yeah.
phenomenon, phenomena.
Yeah. But these usually don't extend. They usually stay within that layer of vocabulary where they originate from. And Romani has got this funny thing, an interesting thing, that the Greek, especially the Greek morphemes, which were borrowed together with Greek words from Byzantine Greek, then expanded and started to be used with later loanwords, creating a specific layer of loanwords which behave differently in morphology, in inflection, in derivation, in different domains. And that I think is, if not unique, then pretty rare. So that I think is quite interesting typologically. Yeah,
Just to
otherwise.
interject, when we talk about morphology in Romani, for people who are not familiar with the terms, I think usually we mean grammatical endings, typically, right? Those sort of grammatical endings that come at the end or sometimes in the middle of the word, but somehow are grammatical. Yeah, that's the morphology concept. Yeah, okay. So right, so let's stay with that and move to. I want to ask you about three structural categories of Romani that you've worked on and made some discoveries on, which are cited quite frequently in Romani linguistics. And it's a challenge. Let's see if we can try and keep it simple and still distinct and specific. So simple in that we can try to avoid in the conversation the particular linguistic terminology that we normally use when we discuss these things from a scientific perspective, but still try and explain what's unique. And the three domains are the first is the case forms of the noun, so the endings that the noun has. And you've touched on one aspect just now. And the second are pronouns, and the third are indefinite expressions, which is like words like something, somewhere, anywhere. So let's take them one by one. So first of all, the nouns. So nouns are words like table, window, man, woman, dog, cat, and so on. So we all know what nouns are. And in English, they come very simply, of course, but in many languages, they have endings. And if you're an English speaker who's tried to learn Turkish or Russian or other languages, then you know that can be quite a challenge. And you've written quite comprehensively and quite early on in your career on you developed a model to describe the cases So the case endings, the forms, the inflectional morphology, so the endings that attach to Romani nouns in a kind of a cross-Romani perspective. So we're looking not just at one dialect, but looking at Romani wholesale, one can say. So maybe take us back to that. How did you approach that? What were the kind of questions that you were interested in, and what were some of the discoveries that you made?
Mhm. Well, my main interest in that paper was actually to reconstruct the what we call inflectional classes of nouns. That is, groups of nouns which behave in the same way, which inflect in the same way. So that was the main interest, and I encountered some problems like the thing I mentioned before, the Greek morphology involved, how it started to influence the inherited, the original morphology, how they interacted, how there were some analogical developments, words were influenced by one another, endings were influenced by one another, etc. Currently, actually, I'm working on this East Gemer dialect, and it's got an interesting thing. It's got a marker of the accusative case. I know, again, it's a term, but if you want to say, I see someone. So in most Romani, I see my mother. In most Romani dialects, you would say something like "dikav da," and there would be no ending on da, which is the accusative, right? No oblique, no. There's an oblique stem, but no ending afterwards. But this particular variety has borrowed an accusative suffix from Hungarian, so it says something like "dikav dat." D is the Hungarian accusative suffix. So that's something pretty rare, I think. And yeah, that's a novel, well, more or less a novel discovery about this suffix.
But back to the question about inflection classes, how does one go about doing that? What's the process to try and postulate different inflectional classes? What do you look for?
Hmm. That's a long time ago. But how did I work? I looked at many descriptions of many different Romani dialects, and I found some commonalities and I found some differences. And I was trying to reconstruct the more original state of affairs. So this difference in this particular dialect seems to be an innovative thing. It seems to have developed later. Why is that? Because this ending was borrowed, or this ending was influenced by the ending of another class. So that must be an innovation. I disregarded. I mean, in the reconstruction. And then, some things turned out to be repeated or could have been reconstructed for the original state, Proto-Romani.
Right, and you basically then designed kind of acronyms, I guess you could call them, for the different classes
Yeah.
at the time, and they were partly divided by first of the distinctions that you mentioned before, so the ecoclitic and the xenoclitic. So those forms that are, you could say, indigenous, I suppose, inherited, versus those forms that are borrowed from other languages. And then other distinctions would be gender, for example, masculine, feminine, number, singular, plural, and
Mm.
so on. And they give you a patchwork of different classes. So basically, we get from data in comparison to classification, and on the way also to, as you said, historical reconstruction, because Romani is a language that has only recently become written. So we can't go back centuries and look at how it's developed before. So let's think of another class now, and that is pronouns. So I, me, you, she. Every language pretty much has pronouns. They use them very differently, of course. It's not always one by one. But what's particular? What were the questions that intrigued you in the system of Romani pronouns? What can you tell us about Romani pronouns?
Yeah, again, this is a long time ago, so I don't know what intrigued me. I was always interested in personal pronouns. My MA thesis was on suppletion in personal pronouns, suppletion being like very irregular relationship between roots. So, for example, in English, I is very distinct from the form me, although they are both first-person pronouns. So there's so-called case suppletion. I was interested in that, and that also, made me interested in Romani pronouns. We also have suppletion there in third person, particularly. So, for example, in Celice, oi would be he or she, but le and la would be him or her. So there's a distinct root. And again, I was trying to reconstruct the original state, the Proto-Romani state of affairs. I don't agree with some of the conclusions I had there nowadays. So,
And so tell us, that's interesting because we started the conversation with a very, very critical self-reflection of yours on racism and the inherited prejudice that we carry, which I found, I mean, that's going to keep me thinking now for quite a while because I don't remember anybody recently being as open as you have, and even just a few words about that. I think it's really important. But let's look at that, self-reflection. Now, academically is another dimension of self-reflection that you've brought in, a critical self-reflection. How does one change one's mind about something like that? I mean, you did a lot of research. You looked at data, so examples, as you said, from different descriptions, grammars, documentation. And is it because you've now come across new information on new dialects that you weren't aware of before, or did you change your method of analysis, or how does one come to new conclusions about the same thing, or revise conclusions that one has had before?
Well, sometimes it's new data. So, for example, we had this paper with Milena Hybšmanová describing very basically the South Central dialects of Slovakia, and there are quite a lot of mistakes because we didn't have enough data. Some of the transcriptions were not correct, and some of the descriptions were simplified. So the new data actually showed us, the new data made us make some progress, and the other thing is reinterpretation. I mean, being persuaded by someone else's argument or thinking about it once again. I'll give you a concrete example. In some dialects of Romani, in most dialects of Romani, we would have something like ame, meaning we, in the nominative, in the basic case, and something like amen in the accusative. Dikas amen. Diken amen, they see us, right? And I think I reconstructed that. What was it? I think I reconstructed amen spreading from the accusative to the nominative, because in some dialects amen has also occurs in the nominative. But I can't imagine how it could have happened nowadays. Sorry, I don't remember the exact argument now, so it's difficult to speak about it. But there's something when I thought, wow, you were quite cheeky that you wrote this, proposal, and I was probably in doubts even then, but I had to decide for something, So
Right. Okay, well, but cheekiness, I suppose, without being a little bit cheeky, you can never publish a scientific paper because we never really have all the answers, unless you're working with an experiment. But even there, sometimes experiments can be bold in their conclusions. Okay, just one more of those categories, okay? And we move on to something else, and that is indefinite expressions, which is I find a fascinating topic, as somebody who's also interested in grammar and structure of language. But I have to say, I mean, my interest in that in different languages emerged after I read and discussed with you some of your work. So your work on indefinite expressions or indefinite pronouns, as they're sometimes called, in Romani really opened my eyes to many things. And then we wrote a little bit about this together later on, incorporating some of your original ideas. So indefinite expressions, just to remind people, are these things that we sort of have a general circumscription of what we're talking about, but we're not specific. So we say something, anything, everything, nothing, but we're not specific about it. And that's what they sort of have in common. And what's particular about indefinite expressions in Romani, and when we compare them, what can we learn perhaps about this general category in terms of its functionality of indefinites?
That's a difficult question for me. Yeah, again, what I did I had a talk about it in a conference which I did never published, but we incorporated some of it into the Marketer's book. That's true, where I tried to reconstruct what the original indefinite pronouns were in Romani. In the dialects I'm most in contact with nowadays in Central Romani, which I investigate most thoroughly currently, the system of indefinite pronouns has been completely restructured. So it's basically semi-calques, semi-borrowings from the contact languages. Just to give an example, in Hungarian, something is vala mi, where mi is what and vala is some, so some what. And in Salice Romani, for example, it would be vala so. So you borrow the prefix and you translate the pronominal base of it, and the whole system is restructured. There's nothing left of the original indefinite system.
But that's the thing, isn't it? You've just kind of put your finger on it. So there's two things that are so specific, so particular to indefinite pronouns. The first is that they're very typically composed of one kind of general indefinite qualifier and another that gives us the semantic specification, like we have in English: something, somewhere, someone, and so on. And second, that one of those elements is very often borrowed from another language in Romani, which makes the system, if you compare it across Romani dialects, so diverse, because each dialect is in contact with another language. But then from what you're saying, they also tend to change very quickly, because you just told us about dialects that are in relative proximity to one another, right? And in contact with the same language, and yet have different indefinite forms.
Did I? Which dialect were they?
Valami is the Hungarian.
It was Hungarian, yeah.
I'm sorry. Okay, yeah.
That was Hungarian, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I also tried to use the publication by Martin Haspelmath about indefinite pronouns, where he has got some nice semantic maps showing how the functions can change. So I tried to apply it in the reconstruction, because typologically speaking, some functions can develop into others, but not the other way around. So I tried to use that in the reconstruction. I can't remember what else I was doing with the indefinite
I guess one of the interesting, maybe unique, again, characteristics of Romani is, because we have so many dialects, we can look at volatility. Because if the dialects have the same word, for example, ame for we, pretty much the same words, then we know, okay, this word is stable. But if they have very different indefinite expressions, as they do, Romani people speaking across dialects will often not understand what the other indefinite expression is, except through context.
Mm-hmm.
We can show that there's something about the structure of indefinites that is perhaps prone to renewal for some reason or other. But I think one of the things that you found in that paper was the reconstruction that you referred to is even looking at some pre-European roots of like ni and so on, and looking at some of those. But anyway, again, that shows us that the comparison can help us with reconstruction of historical things. Right. Okay. I just wanted to kind of give a sample, a taste of what one can do, actually looking, as you said, typologically informed descriptive work on Romani, and how we can actually gather some conclusions from that. So let's move on now to one of your major research projects that I think is in some ways still ongoing and involved a whole team of researchers, and that is the Linguistic Atlas of Central Romani. And I want to come back. Atlas, of course, says something about geography and mapping. And how do you do that with a language like Romani, which many people think people have been moving around or are nomadic and move around? How do you put them on a map is one question. And the other is Central Romani. What is Central Romani? So let's just start with the title of the program and what these two axes. How do you do an atlas of the Romani populations, and what is Central Romani?
Okay, Central Romani is an artificial term, a linguist's term for a group of varieties which are closely related, which are spoken in Central Europe, but that's probably not the source of the term. The source of the term Central is that they are located centrally in relation to other Romani dialect groups. And actually there are two groups, North Central and South Central. We call them Central for convenience, but probably there is no good argument for lumping them together on a par with groups like Vlach Romani, etc., etc. And Central Romani is spoken in Hungary, Slovakia, and the surrounding countries like Czech Republic, Poland, Ukraine, Slovenia, Austria. It also used to be spoken in Czech Republic before the war, but the original Central Romani died out together with its speakers who were killed during the Second World War. I mean, in concentration camps. So the speakers are nowadays mostly settled, and in some areas they've been settled since 1740, 1760, 1780, since quite an early age. Although there were some areas where the speakers still were itinerant, moving around basically into some small designated areas. That was Bohemia, and there was also parts of Hungary. The Vandic Roma were also itinerant. Some of them still remember that. But most of the speakers were settled and have been settled for a long time, which helped to develop quite regular dialectological patterns. Quite regular patterns in terms of gradual diffusion from village to village of linguistic innovations. So there was an innovation and it spread gradually. I actually prepared a map, if I can share it. Is it okay if I share it on Zoom, or would it be difficult to incorporate?
I think we could try. One moment. One moment.
I sent you a request for sharing.
Yes, I allow. Can you?
Yes, now this is a map from our atlas.
Oh, okay.
And it's a lexical map. I just chose one as an example. How do you say to stand, the verb to stand? So the original way of saying that was something like terďol, which are the black dots. And the dots represent varieties, local varieties, where we did some field work, or which had been described in publications, but these were not quite very numerous. And this area, which is actually crosses the boundary between South Central and North Central, which means that it's a quite recent local innovation, there the verb acel, which originally meant to stay, was extended to the meaning to stand, to stay, to stand. So, stay in a place, lack of movement, extended to the meaning stand upright.
So what we see here is that there's a very, very coherent, almost 100% coherent distinction between the black and the white. So there's a particular contained geographical area. And that's quite typical for many of your maps, maybe not for all of them, but for many of the maps of the Atlas, and there's dozens of such maps, which shows that actually in this area, at least in Central Europe, Romani is a very territorial language, just like in...
Exactly. We can see some variations. So there are some on the margins of the area, and sometimes even far away, there are some areas where both are used. So for example, this one. But otherwise, you can have neighboring varieties. And we had the words for stand, the verbs for stand, in our data quite frequently. It's not that there was just one occurrence. So we know quite well, we are quite confident that if the speaker uses acel 7 times or 20 times, but it doesn't, he or she don't use the other verb, it means simply this is the verb in that dialect. So you can see that two neighboring varieties can have the different variants of this feature. And as you say, that shows that there must have been some territorial pattern involved.
Well, that's fascinating. So let's talk a little bit about how you get from the idea of researching it to be able to have these kind of findings and display them on the map. If we can, well, we can maybe blend out the map now again. And so to get to that, and of course multiplied by the so many dozen features that you've looked at, you need to have an idea. You need to have access to speakers that you told us before, but it's not just in one place. It's dozens of different places. So you need to probably have a team, and then you need to collect the data, and then you need some kind of technical procedure to put it on a map like that with all the information. And for all of that, you need time, and you probably also need some funding. So how did all of that, when did it start? How did it start? And how was it carried out?
Mhm. I mean, it had two routes, I would say. One of them was the trips we made with Milena Hybšmanová and her student Hanna Šepková, who were quite aware of the dialect variation in Slovakia, which at that time in the 90s of the 20th century was quite underdescribed. I mean, most of Western Slovakia, we didn't have any idea what varieties are spoken there, or Southern Slovakia. So we made some trips, but at that time we didn't do any systematic research. We were just recording, narratives and making notes. And the other route was your project in Manchester, the database, the Romani database, morphosyntactic database, where
our joint project that we did.
Yeah, okay. Where at some stage we started to acquire data from fieldwork, from speakers in different parts of Europe, and I tried to focus on Central Europe and make it a little bit more detailed. So the first idea was actually to go to those areas where we knew that Romani is in danger of extinction, and to record the last speakers, and we did that. And suddenly we had quite a lot of data from many different places, and I thought maybe we can make an atlas. That would mean we have to go to parts of Slovakia where Romani is still vital, where children are still speaking it, because we didn't focus on that before. And yeah, the idea, I asked for another project for 3 years, and we got it. The major participants were Zhubor Nárova, who talked to you recently, and Michal Beníšek, and the three of us, but we also had lots of help from different students of Romani, either senior students like Pavel Kubaník, who is now an academic himself, working on different aspects of Romani, and also from students who just started to learn Romani. We also used them as our workforce, but for them it was interesting. It was actually a nice way to get into a community, coming with a request about language, about Romani, and then trying to stay in the community for some time. So actually lots of people were involved. I think dozens, maybe 50 people in different periods. And I had financing for travel. I had quite a lot of money for travel, which was great in contrast to how the situation is now. So we really could spend, Zhu, for example, spent months in the fieldwork. So she was like, in one of her field trips, she traveled, I think, into 50 different locations, recording the questionnaire, which usually took 2 days. We had this questionnaire and recording other recordings. Mostly we went for a week or two and, visited a few localities only. Usually we worked in groups. So there was like a group of 3 or 4 people. We stayed in a district town and split for the day, meeting in the evening, sharing the experience, sharing the contacts, talking about what we did and how was it. And yeah, and it grew cumulatively, and suddenly we had over 400 localities documented. The negative part of it is that it was very efficient. It was very economical. You could get a lot of data within a day or two on one variety. Usually it's about 2,000 lexemes and lots of grammar, but it's also superficial. And we tried to add spontaneous data. I mean, data of narratives and conversations. We managed many times, but not always. So sometimes we only have the elicited data, which of course is not the ideal situation, but for some features it's okay, for others it's not. So we got lots of data, and we still need to work on it. the problem is that the project finished a long time ago, and we don't have time. We don't have the capacity. We made over 1,000 maps so far. What we need to write, the comments to those maps. What this variety means and what their distributions are and how they develop. And we need to write an introduction. Every time I meet Michal Benishek, we say we have to start already. But then again, something new comes up and it's very difficult to finish. But we have to do it because that's such a debt to the speakers who spoke to us, to the scientific Romani studies community. That's one of my major tasks for the future, for the immediate future, I hope.
Okay, so on that note, I'll hand back to Anastasiia, and who will take us a little bit into the future and to the closure of our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. In conclusion, we'd like to ask you about the outlook for the Romani linguistics. And from your point of view, what still needs to be explored there, and what else you would like to achieve in this field?
Well, I'll start with the personal view. What I need to do is finish the things I started. I have so many ideas, small ideas, not very important ones, but small ideas on small micro projects, what needs to be described. But I definitely need to finish the atlas together with Michal Benishek, because she's done her work on it, and she's out of academia, or will be soon. And the other thing, I need to finish my grammar of Celitzer-Romani. I'm just about to finish sort of grammar, lexicon grammar, vocabulary grammar of East Romani. That's finished. It's 900 pages. I'm just checking the cross-references now. It doesn't have everything. There's just a little syntax, but it's got all the morphology and lexicon, diachronic layers, etc. So this Celitzer-Romani grammar, atlas, these two major projects, I would like to write a popularizing monograph on Romani in Slovakia for the Slovak audience, because there are still lots of Romani speakers. There's a great interest in in Romani variation, and I think there's a demand for such a publication, which would be something more, I wouldn't say completely popularizing, but more accessible to a general audience. So I'd like to write that. That's another big project. And then I have so many small ideas which I need to finish. I'm not going to talk about that. And generally what Romani linguistics needs, I don't know. I mean, as I said, I think of myself as a descriptivist, so I think still we need some more descriptions. So although we have a lot, but there are still gaps. And as Zhu was mentioning in her conversation with you, some of the dialects are dying out. So if we could focus our attention to those dialects which are in danger of disappearing in the following decade or so, probably we should do the descriptive work there. And in terms of more general things, I'm interested in dialectology, and I think we should also explore things like intelligibility of dialects, perceptual dialectology, which means how the dialect variation is perceived by the speakers themselves. How do they see the differences? Oh, they speak like us, only they sing. No, those speak completely differently. And making some maps, that I think is worth exploring, and also applying some modern methods to Romani dialects like dialectometry. I don't know anything about it yet, but I would like to get into that and try to experimentally play around with that, with the data we have on Central Romani. Yeah, and of course there are many, many things which can be done for Romani linguistics, but just what came to my mind now.
Thank you, Viktor, very much for this fascinating discussion about the language itself and sharing your experience working on Romani, your research. It was really very amazing. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, for inviting me, and for having very interesting and sometimes challenging questions. And I really like your, I don't know the English word now. Is it podcast? No, it's not podcast. It's
yeah, we could say.
I really like your program, your podcast. It's really nice.
It's our pleasure. Thank you very much. And so for our Audience, thank you for being with us and watching the interview. We are looking forward for your comments. Subscribe to the channel and see you next time in our new episode. Bye for now.